Good afternoon if you're on the East Coast, or good morning if you're with Willie in Central or Mountain or Pacific time. If there are callers from around the world, whatever time it is for you, I'm so grateful that you are choosing to invest your time today with me and with Willy Steiner as we discover the joy of leadership. Today we are celebrating the launch of Willy's book, Discover the Joy of Leadership, and we're giving you all an opportunity to learn from his many years of expertise. As we get started today, there are a few things I want to alert you to, and one new thing. So for today's event, we actually have a PDF download handout that Willy will be referring to during today's event. That's going to be located below the question panel, and I hope that you'll take a moment now to locate that handout and download it to use as a reference and guide during today's event. I also mentioned the question panel. We would love to know where you're calling in from today. Those of you who have come to previous events of mine might know that I'm in Lambertville, Michigan. Willy is in Evanston, Illinois, which is a favorite haunt of mine. If you're calling in today from an organization where maybe you've brought a group of people together to learn, I would love to see that as well, so I can give a shout out to your organization. Willy, so far I see that we have at least one caller from Chicago, someone from Virginia, from Alabama, from Minnesota, from Massachusetts. We have a friend who's in a hotel in London. We have a caller from Manitoba and one from Toronto. Welcome to those Canadians in our audience. St. Louis, Seattle, Alaska. Looks like we're going to have many of the states represented. Snowy New Hampshire, those brave folks who are having an amazing winter storm right now. Stay warm, and we're glad you joined us. A couple of other notes as we begin today's call. As is our habit and process here at Weaving Influence, we are recording today's webinar, and it will be available later this afternoon. We also will have also available the slides from today's event as a reference for you as a PDF that we'll send with our follow-up materials. And I would love to invite you, if you love Twitter, like I do, to live tweet with us today. We're going to use the hashtag Joy of Leadership. So if you'd like to participate live in the conversation, we invite you to join us. I want to let you also know that at the end of today's event, we will have time for questions for Willy. And at the very end of the event, we have a very special offer for those of you who are listening. So I hope that you'll stay on with us for the whole hour, and I'll tell you about that offer at the end. I'd also love to welcome anyone who might be attending today who's a member of Leading Edge Alliance and might be participating to get some continuing education credits. If you're part of Leading Edge Alliance, we're grateful for your interest, and we'll be in touch about how you can get those education credits. So I think that I've covered all of that important setup for this event, and now we have the chance to learn from Willy Steiner. Willy has many, many years experience as an executive coach, and his company is Executive Coaching Concepts. He's worked with individuals to help build their performance individually and their organization's performance through his coaching at organizations like Caterpillar, Robert W. Baer, and Time Warner Cable. And I've really thoroughly enjoyed getting to know Willy. He's put a lot of his lessons from his journey as a leader and a coach into his book, and I'm so thrilled that he's going to be sharing with us today. As I said, I'll be back at the end for questions, and now welcome Willy.
Well, good afternoon to everybody. I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to spend this hour with me. I'm hoping to make it a comfortable exchange, just like it would be in any kind of coaching meeting I would have with a client over the years. Over the years, it's been actually I'm into my 21st year, and I've coached well over 450 people. So one of the things I try to do in working with clients is I like to try to engage them, try to educate them with concepts and models that can be useful to them. I like to encourage them as best I can, but I'm never gratuitous. It's never just to pump them up, because they need, me to be as honest and forthright as I can. And I also really try to help them to explore options. In this webinar, we're going to be covering some hopefully very interesting information that's really covered in the book, but this is going to be at a little bit higher level. Basically, when I work with an executive client, in that 1 year, we'll spend well over 40 hours of time and energy towards trying to help them, number one, become their own best coach, and improve their effectiveness and their ability to impact their organization. Today I'm going to try to do all that in about 40 minutes. So in terms of the alliteration of all the other E's, now it'll be actually kind of an expedited time. So with that in mind, let me go to my first slide. And when I think about the world of work, in a perfect world, every company would be like this stool. It would be very solid and sturdy. And the three legs of that stool, as you can see here, are profits, process, and people. Now, the profits are not just the net gain that a company makes, but it's all the accounting and the numbers and everything else that goes into it, measuring your costs and all those things. So all of that's included there. The process is how you make or how you create whatever product or service that you deliver. This is the what that people pay you for. And then, of course, there's the people, and that includes various and sundry things. So in a perfect world, you've got this very comfortable, solid seat here that's the company, and these three absolutely asymmetrical and solid legs. The problem is that that's not necessarily how the world really works. It's actually a little more like this. And that is that it's the people side of things that makes things a little bit more challenging. I've worked in the area of the profits and the process. I've been a business owner and run many businesses myself, so I understand those pieces. But that's not my area of expertise. And fortunately, I like to focus on the people side of things, which is really where the big challenges come up. One of my favorite clients is a guy named Frank, and he likes to say, at our company, we hire the very best employees you can possibly find. We screen them to be sure they have the right skills, they have the right attitude, that they have the right knowledge base. And he said they also work really hard at trying to be sure they're going to be a good fit for that company and that culture, which is really important considering that his firm has actually been named one of the top 100 places to work by Fortune for the last 13 years. So despite Frank's real pride in that particular perspective, the problem, he says, is, yeah, we try to hire those employees, and the problem is human beings show up, and that all goes to kind of hell in a handbasket because, well, human beings show up, and that makes it a little bit more challenging to kind of manage. And unfortunately, again, for me, that's where I make a living, is trying to help people with that side of things. So let's move forward then. This represents kind of my overall view of what my leadership coaching is all about. I'd like to talk to you about, first of all, the structure that this represents. If you think about this leadership as a house, and I want to talk about the structure of the book as well as the structure of my coaching work, which will give you an idea about what we're going to try to cover here today. First of all, in the book, the structure is that each chapter that you'll have will start with an opening quotation, and then there'll be either a story or an example of a challenge that one of my clients have had to deal with or that I've noted from other kinds of resources. I then try to apply a tool or a model to help you think your way, just like I've done with the clients, to show how you can think your way through that particular challenge. I actually, as a person, as an individual, I think a lot in models, and a lot of my work is geared just that way. So that's one of the things that I share. Then the question is, well, what happened? Here are the results of that. And then we basically, I end the chapter with 3 to 5 key questions that can help prod you to kind of think about, well, how would I apply that in my situation? And each of the chapters of the book is only 3 to 5 pages long. It's not meant that you have to wade through a 25-page chapter to kind of come to an idea. Basically, you're going to look through the table of contents. If a particular topic or the description of that chapter meets, kind of what you're thinking about, boom, you can go to that and get a great idea. If that's not the right one, you can go to another. So there also in the book are quite a few pages of great resources that I've accumulated over many years. These are my very, very favorite ones. And again, in my work, I've got some new and I think original work that I share and have developed with my clients. But I also like to say I've really been able to beg, borrow, and steal from the very best thinkers in the world of communication and leadership and management. So I do everything I can to try to help people kind of figure that out. So the bottom line is, when you think about this whole model here of leadership, you've got to think there are some of these foundational blocks. And the ones that I zero in on are time. How do you spend your time most expeditiously and effectively? How do you build, maintain, and enhance relationships all around you in the workplace? How do you communicate for both influence and for your ability to make things happen? And lastly, and again, this is especially true in this rapidly changing world that we're in, how do we help people and help you manage the process of change? So within each of these four areas, which I think are the bedrock or the foundation of what management is all about. And one of the sad things is that anymore a lot of companies just don't spend the money to actually go ahead and put the effort into helping people learn those basics. And so for many of us, it's kind of a process of trial and error. At the very beginning of my book, there's a quote that I came across, and the CFO says to the CEO of this company, well, if we spend all this money on training people, well, what happens if they leave? And the CEO pauses and he responds, well, what happens if we don't and they stay? And that's just something for you to think about too. If we can't figure out some ways to learn more about these, it doesn't necessarily come through osmosis. Doesn't mean that trial and error doesn't work, but my goal here today is to be able to give you some general ideas that we can work through more quickly. So let's go ahead and go to the very first of the concepts, which is really time. And by time, I mean it's the idea, the limited time resources that you have. How can you maximize and get the very best use of them you can? And I apologize for that. I am actually working off of a fairly serious cold over the last couple of weeks, so I may take a small drink of water along the way, so excuse me. But to get immediately to talk about the concept of time, one of the things that I use is a model, like I talk about many of the other models I use. This one actually comes from the work, it's called the Covey model, it comes from the work of Stephen Covey. And basically, there are four quadrants here, and it talks about things that are both urgent and not urgent, and then important and non-important. And so the bottom line is, and we're going to walk through these from in this kind of a direction. So let's start here with the very first area, what's urgent and what's important. Now, before we move on, one of the issues that I think is a challenge for us all is that in today's world, everything is urgent. We have this situation where it's this immediacy bias, that if all of a sudden, the ping goes off and you've got an email, it's almost like a Pavlovian response. So, oh, we've got to look at that. We've got to see what's going on. When, in fact, I'm old enough to remember that, we put things in the snail mail and we wait till it gets from Indianapolis to New York, and during that period of time, the world didn't fall apart. But right now, we've got that issue. And so you have to guard against that. The good thing about things that are urgent is once they're urgent, after a period of time, they're just not urgent anymore. But so anyway, let's start with this first quadrant. Things that are urgent and important. And these are things like certain crises, pressing problems, deadline-driven projects, meetings, or preparations. And this, ladies and gentlemen, this is how you are where you are. Your ability to produce, to be reliable and dependable about making stuff happen, this is what's really important, and this is how you've got where you are. And that is an incredible part of how you've developed your reputation. And your management skills have helped you get there and stay there. The challenge is that you've also got things that are very important, but they're not urgent. And that's over here in Quadrant A. Quadrant A is really that area of this chart that is really where leadership actually comes to flourish. To prepare for things, to prevent other things from happening, clarifying values, the planning that goes into the execution of any great program. The ability to build relationships. If you need a connection with somebody for something and you haven't worked at developing that in the past, that's not really relationship building, that's begging. And there are ways we will talk about to be able to do that a lot more effectively. I talk about true recreation here. When you get away, how do you just relax and recharge your batteries? And if you're going to empower somebody, your team, You can't just do that by giving it to them and hoping for the best. That's actually called abdication. So the idea is we want to talk about, and this is what I do in my work with my clients, how can they get more of a time? Now down here, this is called not urgent and not important. Don't even worry about this. I mean, none of you that are worth your salt can really spend any time here that's of any value whatsoever. Now, the other side, the other quadrant right here, quadrant C, where things are urgent but not important, is an interesting one. Some interruptions, some mail, meetings, and by the way, meetings are the bane of everyone's existence, and I've got a couple great chapters in the book about how to run an effective meeting. And again, I think that's one of the things that gets in the way of so many of my clients. Many pressing problems, some popular activities, FaceTime things that you have to do as leaders. They just have to be there. Now, what's interesting about this, or the distinction I like to make, is when you say that they're urgent but not important, when people are bringing this stuff to you, it's important to them. But in terms of the work that's on your plate for that day or that week or your particular goals, it may not be quite as important to you. And so you've got to think a little bit about how to work your way through that. So in the handout, if any of you have had a chance to download it, I have these 4 quadrants listed. And what I'd like you to do is just roughly kind of put down what percentage of time do you currently spend in A, B, and C. It's a rough cut, it's a rough guess, but it's a starting point for further work that we're going to do in this whole area of how to manage our time better. So the question is, how do you attack this? Well, one of the things that I like to have people look at is what I call time buckets. And there's a really good chapter in the book called How to Do a Time Bucket Analysis. That's kind of a goofy way of saying it, but that's actually kind of my way of looking at it. And the bottom line is, this is a kind of a chart that comes from the former CEO of Starbucks. Basically, he said, I only do 4 things. I talk to my direct reports. I visit the roasting plants in the stores. I meet with my employees, and I work with on strategy and staff reviews. That's my world. He had 4 buckets. Also in your handout, there's a place for you to look and identify your 5 to 7 key buckets. I ask you to limit it to that, because if you break it down any further than that, it's too fine a line of gradation. Now, what should your buckets be? Well, just think about the key things you're responsible for. How is your performance measured? That's going to give you pretty much the insight that you need in terms of what your buckets are, including maybe a couple key projects that you're working on. But think about looking at that. And if you look at identifying that and putting those buckets down, then the question is, how much time should I spend in each? And then how much time do I actually spend? And the only way you're going to get to know that is by literally measuring your time. Now, if you think about and identify clearly those buckets, you know which is which. You could go back and actually look at, basically your Outlook calendar. You're going to know which is going to fit into which bucket. You can go back 2 months, tally it all up, and kind of see where your time is actually going. Then you can think about, well, gee, how am I doing relative to how much I should be spending in each bucket? You can also just start tracking it going forward. The bottom line is, if you don't actually try to measure this, you're never really going to get a good handle on it. So when it comes to the idea of time, the first thing you got to do is find the time to do the performance that, again, is how your success is measured. So that's the first thing. The second key things are you spending the right amount of time to plan for your work, to prepare for your meetings, your presentations, for everything that you need to do? I don't care if you make lists or what kind of a tool you use, but you probably can do better. And you probably have all said to yourself, wow, I wish I would have had a little bit more time to think of that. You've also got to take the time to build the relationships. Again, you can't do that just in a hurry. As a matter of fact, when I think about all 4 of these, I'm reminded of, I saw on Meet the Press the other day, Bob Gates, who used to be our Secretary of Defense. He was the president of Texas A&M University. And he's also been a very successful executive. When they asked him, how does he really manage his time? He said, the first thing I do is I carve out 90 minutes for myself every single day, because he says, otherwise, you're going to fill up my day with stuff and I never get to my stuff. And boy, have I seen that happen with so many of my clients over the years. And lastly, especially in a leadership role, you've got to be able to reinforce the values of what it means to work for you, with you, and for your firm. And you've got to continue to reinforce, here's the vision, here's the why we're doing this, here's where we're going. That's a very critical part. Your clarity and your reinforcement of that is a key reason that you really are going to want to spend that time. Well, let's move on to the next building block, and that's relationships. When we think about relationships, there's a couple key things that you got to understand. First of all, every time we're working with somebody else in a situation and there's a conversation going on, we engage in relationships because we're trying to make things happen, and there are different people have different opinions on how to do that. So what you've got to think about is, first of all, how do you get agreement with folks? And I ask you in this regard because, especially if we think about, and again, I'm not getting political on you here, but we live in a kind of a poisoned atmosphere right now politically. And I think it kind of has an impact on a lot of times how we treat each other, even at work, and it's unfortunate. Good organizations don't allow this to happen. But for you to be able to get agreement with somebody else, the first question is, am I empathic to that other person's perspective and needs? You've got to understand where they're coming from to see where's the common ground. Sometimes you can't afford to give, but the better you understand that, the better engaged you're going to be able to do, and the better a relationship you're going to be able to establish. Now, if in fact you do have to disagree with somebody, ask yourself, is this disagreement about my need to win or to be right, or is it really about finding the very best solution? Does my approach to how I try to work a disagreement or an agreement, can I agree to disagree agreeably, or do I get a reputation for it's my way or the highway? So the problem is, if that's what happens, if you don't find ways to get agreement and to make that happen effectively for both sides, it's going to be difficult for people to maintain a relationship with you. In addition to that, I think the most important part of relationships is the trust that we're able to establish with other people. I think, in the way I look at it, that trust is really the lubricant that makes any relationship work. The problem is, trust means different things to different people. So I've come up with these three questions, and in every 360-degree interview that I do for clients, I ask each of the people I interview these three questions very, very specifically. If each one of them is answered in a positive vein, you're well on your way to a good, strong, trusting relationship. But it's also a good diagnostic to figure out what may be the problem. So the first is, and ask this about yourself, when you think about how do other people think about you relative to the trust they have between you two, ask yourself, do they think that I'm reliable and dependable? Do I do what I say I'm going to do when I say I'm going to do it? And maybe if I can't get it done, then do I at least try to give them a heads up so that they know whether or not something that they may have to kind of change their plans. The secondly thing is, if they ask me for my feedback, do I give it to them in an honest and candid fashion? In other words, do I hold back? Can I be absolutely clear about what I'm trying to get at? We have a thing here in the Midwest called Midwestern Nights. We don't really want to hurt anybody's feelings, and so we hold back. And the problem with that is that's not that constructive. Like I said to you when I talk with my clients, I'm never gratuitous. I don't just tell them they did a great job if they're not. They count on me to be able to say, and one of my best clients one time said, Willie, you're always the guy that I know if I'm being a butthead, you'll tell me that. And that's important too. You don't have to be a butthead about it, but the constructive feedback has got to be there. It's meant to move things forward for absolutely everybody. And lastly, in terms of trust, the idea is if they share something with you in confidence that they know it will be maintained in just that fashion. Now, an important thing to think about this is sometimes the other person may not know if what you've shared with them should be kept in confidence. And so it's always incumbent upon you to be sure, I'm just testing that with you, or don't repeat that for the current time, whatever it might be. So the bottom line, you think about these three things. Are you reliable, dependable? Do you really give that honest, candid, and constructive feedback? And will you maintain a confidence? As I say, if all three of those are positive, you're probably well on your way to a trusting relationship. If not, you can probably identify some things that you might want to do differently that could add to that going forward. Now, the next thing we have to think about in terms of relationship is what I call the networking opportunity. And in your handout, there's an opportunity for you to write down 10 key relationships. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Now, the first thing here is within the company itself, this area in the middle, one of the things you need to think about is who are the people that I work with that I really need to get to know better. When I say get to know, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to have them to be your friends. You need to be friendly with the people you work with, but who has knowledge or experience or that I could help or they could help me, that I need to develop that relationship by spending the time and getting to know them. That's a really critical point. In addition to that, although when we think of networking, a lot of times the only way we think about it is, well, geez, I've got to think about this just because I'm trying to go find a job. That's the only reason you network. Not true. Your value within your organization is in direct relationship to the people you know outside the organization as well. There can be industry thought leaders. If you follow their blog or you go to their conferences or things like that, people that you know and admire, their thoughts, bringing those thoughts and that current knowledge in is really helpful. There are academic thought leaders. Again, people that you follow, their work, their blogs, their writings, their books. The more you know about that, the more you can bring that to bear with new ideas, fresh ideas in meetings, perspectives. That enhances your value and your value to the organization. You may have certain consultants that you've worked with over the years. I happen to think very firmly that everybody needs to have their favorite consultants if possible. But when you have relationships with some of those folks that have new and cutting trends, those are folks you call to bounce ideas off on and maybe refer to business. That's important. And then there's certain outsourced services where, you know, there are people that know how to do various things, whether it's mailings or PR or whatever. Again, your benefit within the organization is only enhanced by some of those people you can call, well, hey, I know somebody I can call, or I know somebody has a perspective on that I'd like to check with. I think when you think about that, you go, yeah, that's true, but gee, that takes a lot of time. Exactly. It certainly does, but you've got to understand it's a value to you, and it's also really a critical value to the organization that you're able to do that. So when it comes to relationship, the first and most important thing, be sure that you do everything possible to build the trust that's needed to make sure that's a solid relationship. Figure out a way to find time for networking. First of all, within your team, within your organization, within your group, and then externally. You know, start with a handful of key names, what I've asked you to do, and it's on the handout. Identify 10 key people you'd like to know or you respect and you'd like to get to know better, learn more about them and who they are. And actually and again, you'll find in the book there's a whole bunch of stuff about really actually how to start your networking process. And again, I've got some great information from some great people along those lines. The next thing that you want to do is, in terms of relationships, manage them. Don't take them for granted. People appreciate when you call them up and just say, well, how are you doing? Here, I wanted to pick your brain about this. Or, oh, by the way, I came across this. It made me think of you. I hope you can take benefit of that. That's just a great, nice thing to happen. And it doesn't take you that long to do. That's managing relationships. Relationships with your subordinates are another really key thing. I've had some people, it's just amazed me, they don't have regular scheduled interchanges with their team or with their peers or with their boss. Those are all relationships you have to manage. Plug those needs in and actually work hard to manage them and figure out what to do. Secondly, you've got to assert yourself. The reality is that sometimes relationships go awry in organizations. People overstep their boundaries. They can be rude, or they can kind of step on your territory, or basically not follow through on the kind of obligations that they've made to you. You have to be assertive about these kind of things. There's a couple great chapters in there. One in particular, it's called How to Use an I Language Assertion, a way to actually put something together to go back and say to somebody, you've pushed the edge a little too far. When you did this, this happened. I need you to do this, and let them know that. The problem is that when that happens and you don't do anything, you know this, but you're enabling them to keep doing it. I've talked very clearly in terms of communication and in the relationships about how you can do things and be careful and planful, but let people know you can't be pushed any further. And lastly, the key reason that you're trying to build relationships is this is about your ability to influence things within your organization, for you to get heard, for your ideas to have relevance and impact within the organization. There's an old quotation from Winnie the Pooh. He says, sometimes you got to come out of your corner of the forest and go find other people. And the same thing with your ideas. You've got to reach out and let them know. You've got to put them on the table. And it's by your efforts to be able to do that that it's going to make a difference. So with that in mind, let's kind of move to the next area. And that is the whole idea of communications. And again, the key thing here is I'm talking about communications from the perspective of this is what you need to do to be able to influence people and to have impact. In a very simple way, I look at basically this is the human head. And the three elements of communication are as follows. First of all, it's the verbal. The verbal is just the words that you use. The vocal is the intonation. It's how quickly you speak, how loudly you speak, the emphasis you put on the words. You know what I'm talking about. But that's the vocal side of it. And then there's the visual, or basically the nonverbal part of it. It's what we see. So I'm sure you've heard of that breakdown before. But what you may not necessarily realize is that there are three different ways we have an option to communicate. One is face-to-face. Now that could be when I'm one-on-one with you in a meeting room or in a conversation in a meeting or in a meeting room. It also can be in these days and age, it could be Skyping, it could be FaceTime, it could be the whole idea of being on webinars like this, video conferencing. You also have the telephone. In the telephone, you pick up other things that you don't necessarily pick up when it's just on an email, but that's the other form. And then, of course, there's email. And by email, I mean we're also kind of including texting and twittering and all other kinds of forms of electronic communication. So the issue is when we think about communication, you've got these three areas. The issue, though, is that the efficiency of our information flow goes basically from left to right. It's amazing when you consider all the attachments and everything that you can put within email, how much information. I mean, I send my book out electronically, in a PDF to people. It's phenomenal. And so it's a very efficient way. The problem we run into is the effectiveness of the communication is just the opposite. And again, you have to think about that for a second. But that's really what comes up when we figure we have a communication vibration. I call them a vibration when there's a connection that didn't quite work well. A lot of times it's for this particular reason, that we didn't quite connect. And for thinking about that, you've got to remember that the words themselves are only 10% of the communication. The actual vocal part of things is 35%. And by the way, this isn't just my opinion. There have been lots and lots of communication studies that have reinforced these percentages over the years. And that also means that literally 55% of communication is in the visual or the nonverbal. Now, some of you may have seen those statistics before. Some of you who haven't might go, that seems a little fishy to me. Well, I have one little technique that most people find kind of interesting, and so I'd like you to bear along with me. So wherever you are right now, do exactly what I'm asking you to do. Take your finger, your forefinger and your thumb, and put them together like this as a circle. Put your hand out here to the right, and then I want you to do exactly what I'm telling you to do. take your finger and I want you to take this circle and I want to put it right on your chin, just like I did. That's right, right on your chin. Now, a lot of you probably caught on to that pretty quickly, that that's not my chin. This is my chin. But that happens. That's just a perfect example of how the nonverbal, the visual, trumps the other parts of it. So the bottom line is, when we have that opportunity to be face-to-face, again, whether it's in a meeting, FaceTime, kind of any kind of a tool like a webinar, you're going to pick up 100% of that communication vibration. If you can't do that, however, and that's harder to do, at least you get 45% of it when you're on the phone, because you can pick up the vocal. You can, if you're really excited about something, you can hear that in somebody's tone of voice. If you see that they're not really very excited, you pick that up as well. The problem then is with email, you really only get the words, 10%. And there's been lots and lots of stuff that's been written about the dangers of email. For instance, never send an email when you're angry. I have several chapters in the book about email protocol and things like that that I've learned over the many, many years. And again, it evolves as you think about Twitter and texting and whatever. It's a great tool to use, but it's one that we have to use at our peril. So when we think about the whole idea of communications, one of the things we have to be sure we do is we focus on listening. The idea of listening effectively is critical. I have several chapters in the book that talk about this. And when it comes to really good listening, I have 10 rules of being a good listener. The first is stop talking. And the 10th is stop talking. Everywhere in between, there's a lot of other things we can learn too. The key thing is we want to be fully present with the people we're with. Even if we can only afford to, say, focus on something for a couple minutes, be all in with them. Don't be looking at your computer screen. I put my phone away, so I'm not looking at this screen. I'm checking on, what somebody might have sent me in terms of an email or a text. Be focused, even for a short period of time, so that you know that person knows you're really communicating with them. We can always learn to listen better. It's one of the biggest challenges in this world in which we have so much disruption. Now, I'd like to say something about this, which is kind of interesting. There's always unintended consequences when we try new and different things like this. When I talk to my clients, I'm actually always talking to them about ways they can adjust their behavior, how to behave different. If I'm going to be focused and fully present with you, that may be a different way of behaving while I'm listening to you than looking at this or looking at that or looking at this. And it's different for people. So one of my clients who thought about this went down to visit one of his co-workers. They were on a project together, and they had some kind of tough challenges in terms of their relationship. So he went in, he sat down, and he asked him a whole bunch of questions about a project they were working on. At the end, he goes, well, thank you very much. That's been very helpful. And he got up to leave. And the guy goes, wait a minute. What are you leaving for? He goes, oh, I got what I needed. Well, why are you asking? You just asked me questions. You didn't ask me to do anything. And he actually literally got up and got between him and the door, wanting to know. He was so curious. Why are you just asking me these questions? So, first of all, it showed that my client was able to listen well. But it also, my point is that it can kind of show people it's kind of a different thing. Now, when it comes to feedback, an important part of our ability to communicate is being able to get feedback and to give it effectively. The bottom line that I want you to think about is when you give feedback, don't wait. Don't wait for the annual performance review. When you give feedback, find a way to give it to people as timely as possible, and don't worry about. Be sure that you give guidance. Give them the positives, give them the negatives, but try to do it as immediately as you can. And although it's very difficult, and by the way, there are several chapters in the book just on this very specific topic, how do you get feedback? A lot of us are frightened to get feedback from folks. We get our annual performance review, we look at it, and like everybody does when I give them their feedback from my clients, they go right to the stuff that's the bad stuff and they forget about the good stuff. And that's exactly not what we want you to do. The other thing from communications, I want you to do, spend the time to prepare whatever message you're going to send. When it's an email, Reread your email before you send it. If you're going to give a presentation, practice it. When you deliver your message, try to get especially if you can do it in a whole group setting, read the room, see what's going on, get a whole sense of what that's all about. In your handout, you'll also see several key ideas that you can look at to try to find ways to communicate even more effectively. And just pick a couple. Don't have to do them all, but just pick one or two that you think would be useful for you. All right, the last foundational area is the idea of change. I don't really think I need to tell anybody that right now we're in an age where the pace of change, especially the last almost 3 weeks of a new president here in our country, things are changing very, very rapidly. In addition to that, this is an age of disruption, and that's hard for everybody. I don't care, where you are. It turns out, though, that when we think about the idea of change, there used to be an old model that was pretty much, well, things ended on a Friday, and this is where the organization structure was, or the reporting relationships, or a new business we closed, or a new one began on Monday. It was really pretty simple. We thought of it that way. There's a gentleman named William Bridges, though, and he brought a whole different thought to this. And basically he said, wait a minute, there actually is a phase right here in the middle, and he calls it the transition. Things end, and that's really important for what's going on. I mean, we have to understand what's getting left behind, because people do approach things as either a loss or a gain. And then things begin anew. But he said here in the middle, this is where people get stuck. He referred to this as the wilderness, or the neutral zone. And there are certain feelings and things that come up during this period of time that can be very, very troubling. And so what he basically came up with was some key questions that I would encourage you to think about any change that you're involved with. I'm sure you're involved in a personal level, professional level, organizational level. You're probably involved in lots of changes right now. But pick one or two and then ask yourself these questions about this change. What is actually changing? Have to answer that specifically. If it's you and your team and you're talking about implementing a new process or a new software system or whatever, well then, can you say in a clear, consistent fashion, what actually are we changing? Because then the next logical question is, what's actually going to be different? One of the most important contributions I think Bridges made to this whole idea of what change is all about is that people look at change as either a loss or a gain. Okay? If we look at it as a loss, we're going to be held back. We're going to be reluctant to let go of the old ways. And that's why it's also important when you think about what's different is not just what's different, but what stays the same. Let people know about what they can continue to count upon, the familiar that they know about, and then start to help them process their approach to engaging and basically getting in touch with embracing what's going to be different. People will always change or go through that process in their own ways, and it's going to be difficult. The key thing is who's going to lose what. And when we talk about loss, what are we talking about? Well, it could be a loss of a position. It could be a loss of a role. It could be different coworkers they're going to work with. Companies change, different names. You can change locations. There's a zillion things. And the problem is, even when people think about that and they go, oh, I understand the reason for this change, the emotional actually trumps the intellectual. They do get hung up on that sense of loss. And this is an important thing for you to think about when it comes to change. Lastly, and this is my contribution, where are the boiled frogs? There's some of you may be familiar with the idea of what's called the boiled frog syndrome, that if you take a frog and you put them in boiling water, they'll try to jump out. But if you put them in a water and bring it up to a boil, they'll just sit there until they boil, because it's a gradual change. You're going to deal with people and you're never really going to quite know where they are in this path of moving towards this new beginning. But you have to connect with people. You have to be able to understand who are the people that are getting left behind, and try to get a good sense of that and understand that. When you are going through change, the first thing you've got to ask yourself and try to reinforce again and again and again is, why are we doing this? You have to try to anticipate what are the impacts of these changes going to be on people. One of the great things about working your way through these models on change is that you can't predict what's going to happen, but it can give you some insights about how people are going to react to it. That's the behavior that you have to deal with. If you think about, I like to refer sometimes when people are responding negatively to change, even in the absence of whatever the new situation is going to be, I refer to them as catastrophic fantasies, the crazy things that they come up with that you can never really imagine where they came from. Well, these are some of the things we try to help people with. The process of change is you've got to manage it. You can't just announce it and hope for the best. You have to communicate where we're going, why we're doing this, and you have to continue to do that. I had one of my clients who was the head of an investment bank. He had an international meeting I attended. His description of the new strategy they laid out was amazing. A couple months later, I said, Steve, how's that going? He goes, you know what? I don't think people were paying attention. I said, well, how have you talked about it since? He goes, I told him once, that's all I needed to. No, you've got to continue to reinforce it. And you've also got to be sure that you do everything you can to mark your progress, to track how things are doing. Let people know where the bumps on the road, where it's going well, and what they can expect next. It's the least that they can probably hope for in terms of the process. So, when it comes to the whole process of leadership, this is my fundamental model. I concentrate on trying to help my clients understand each of these key areas of change, communications, time, and relationships. The issue of leadership is actually a slightly higher order issue. And I love this quotation from Peter Drucker, the great management thinker, that management is doing things right. Leadership is doing the right things. I actually have this on the back of my business card. The issue is we have to manage well so we can get to do the leadership things. And that's what I hope for you. And in terms of my work, I hope this book will give you some great insights about all of that. So the key thing, leadership's about vision. It's how we inspire other people. It helps to motivate them to move ahead. You've got to engage them when you do it. And whatever happens, you have to continuously find ways to help them improve at all times. Because the world is all about how you do things quicker, better, and faster. There are some keys to being a great leader, and these are in the handout. But keep your eyes on the prize. What are our goals? I really suggest you do track your time. Figure out how to be selfish about your time, where in fact it's going to make the most difference. Give that great feedback to people, figure out how to do it great, but also try to do it now. And be sure you solicit feedback and listen well to people. Stop doing something all the time. There's a great chapter in there about how you can actually eliminate things from what's in the big maelstrom of all the stuff that's going on right now. Network for fun and profit. Cultivate those relationships and trust. When I say cultivate, if you're going to grow something, you have to till that soil and work on it. You've got to become change ready. And lastly, you've got to be sure that you master management so that you can aspire to lead. And with that, I'll end my presentation, and I look forward to any comments or questions from there. Thank you.
Sorry about that, Willie. It took me a minute to get myself unmuted, and we would welcome your questions and comments. I've seen a few comments coming in throughout the event. I'm curious, and I'll start with my question while we wait for a few people to chime in with theirs. I'm curious, Willie, what you do when folks are so tied into their phones. I've heard a lot of friends recently just mentioning things like, you go into a restaurant and everyone's looking at their phone, or, people are in a conversation or don't attend to the person right in front of them. So do you have any ways that you coach your clients about that kind of addiction to what's present and their technology?
Well, just recently I had a client, and in the feedback that their folks gave them, they mentioned how angry they were that this particular woman was checking her phone all the time. She had, she had teenage kids, and she was worried about them. That's fine, but it was a real sign of disrespect for the people in the room. And when she heard that, quite frankly, she was just mortified. And so she made it a point that I'm going to put my phone down, I'm going to put it away when I'm in meetings. And she did. When I did the follow-up interviews, they said she had done a great job of that. So it's a matter of, it's always about awareness, and then it's agreeing what behavior you're going to do things differently.
Got it. Okay. A couple of people along the way have been asking about the handouts, so I want to quickly reference that before we move on to other questions. The handouts are available in your GoToWebinar panel. If you look at the panel, you're going to see that we have the questions, we have handouts and chat, and there in the handouts you should be able to find the PDF and download it for your use. And we will also send that with our follow-up materials. So thanks to all of you who've been asking. I have a comment here from Jay who's talking about the importance of scheduling time in your calendar to get something done. And I think that's one of the things that really stood out to me. So people are having trouble with the handouts, and we will absolutely be sending those along with the recording after the event. At any rate, here's a challenge that I've seen some authors, not authors, I've seen some leaders face, that you block off time for something important and then it gets just completely taken away by whatever happens to be urgent. So would you have any recommendations about how to actually stick to the time that you block for those important priorities?
Well, it gets back to the fact that, stuff happens. I mean, and crises occur. But when we're trying to learn a new behavior, if you block off that time and you stick to it. Now, sometimes being able to get a couple hours at a time during the day, that's tough. So make it in smaller increments. Give yourself, a half hour in the morning, a half hour around lunch, and like a half hour right after the end of the day. Break it down, but commit to that. Put it on your calendar. I've seen a lot of clients, people can just write in just take their time off their calendar. So I say block it off and say it's taken. And it's taken for you. You can always give it away, but if you don't make it a purposeful effort to go ahead and put that on there and stick to it, and if you always have to keep going back, because the thing is, if you stick to it, you'll see the value in it. And when you see the value in it, you'll commit to the different behavior. It's just a straightforward way of looking at it like that, but you've got to make the effort.
Sure. So I have a question that came in from Jared, and he's wondering about the whole concept of the boiled frog. And he's wondering how you get boiled frog employees to get on board with change, because many or most resist even when the change benefits them.
Well, I think one of the key things is try to help them understand or help you understand why are they resisting this? What is it about it, even if it's beneficial? Again, it gets to that idea, what's their sense of loss? Sometimes that's hard for people to understand, but they do it for an emotional reason, not necessarily intellectual. Well, I'm used to doing it this way, I like doing it that way, I'm familiar with that, or I'm not comfortable. Those are all very valid, but it's not a good reason to resist. The key thing is help them find a way to understand, or to at least communicate what is getting in their way. I think that's one of the best ways of doing it.
Got it. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Can you talk a little bit, Willy, about people's resistance to changing the method of communication? So you mentioned that, email is not a really great way to communicate. On the phone is better. Face-to-face is better yet. So what do you do when people are stuck in only wanting to stick to email for communication?
Well, first of all, when I have clients that share with me email strings that go on 5, 6, 7, 8 times, I'm thinking you probably could have solved this in a phone conversation, because you literally can go back so much more quickly on the topics. So email is great, but once you've gone back 3 or 4 times, pick up the phone or walk down the hall if you can. A lot of times you can't. They could be in different countries. But use a different tool. Use a different method. The issue, I don't know why people would be reluctant to use the phone. Maybe some people aren't comfortable, and maybe some people aren't comfortable with face-to-face. But I think one of the things that I get to add in the book in so many different ways is the value of that connection. It's that people connection that in this day and age we tend to lose. So again, the key thing is it's that over-reliance on email that's the problem. And so I think, by just you picking up the phone, and sometimes you have to schedule a call, but just keep at it. Otherwise, again, you're going to enable them to stick with that same methodology, and if it's not going to work before, it's not going to work in the future.
Sure. So I have a question, and I think that you should be able to answer this. Thelma is wondering what's the best way to equate the points from the four quadrants about, important, urgent, not important, not urgent, to children. So if we have folks on the call who are parents, is there a way that we can teach our kids these concepts early so that they can make good choices about prioritizing early in life?
Boy, I'll tell you what. I think if I asked my kids, well, I think at least one of them is on here today, she would say I'm basically not well qualified to answer that question. Um, but I think if you think about it, things that are urgent and important, you got to do your chores today. You got to make your bed today. Um, if quadrant A would be reading or learning something, taking some time. TV time is in that other quadrant. And then the stuff where they're basically interfering with your time when you're trying to make dinner, when you're trying to, go on an errand or whatever. You've got to. The key thing is you've got to be able to learn how to say something to people to let them know your priorities as well. That's as good as I can probably do in that.
Got it. So we have a question from someone wondering if written materials are a form of communication.
Oh, absolutely. It can be an
Uh,
excellent.
for sure. And it seems like I might have gotten that question about the four quadrants wrong. Thelma was wondering about the model that you used with time and communication related to how children could benefit from that.
I'm not sure I completely understand the question.
Yeah, I'm kind of missing that too. So Thelma, what I'm going to recommend is perhaps we can follow up with you via email after the webinar and see if we can help you with your question. Um, So I think that we're just about out of time. I want to remind everyone that we will be sending out the handout and the recording via email after this call. And I mentioned at the beginning of the call that we had a special giveaway. Today, the giveaway is not the book. I want to encourage anyone who's on the call, if you can benefit from more learning from Willy Steiner, to get this book because it's full of really practical sections, lots of questions for reflection, and this is really going to help you if you want to dig deeper into discovering the joy of leadership. However, if you would email me, and I'm going to ask you to email a different email address. We have a brand new email address, webinars@weavinginfluence.com. If you can email me at webinars@weavinginfluence.com with some feedback about today's event, Willy is going to choose a couple of people that he's going to give a free hour of coaching to, where he's going to send some materials that you can prepare in advance, and then he's going to meet you for an hour on the camera so that you have that two-way face-to-face communication, and he'll be able to coach you through whichever item is going to be most helpful to you. And we'd love to have you get that opportunity to talk further with him. So I'm going to repeat again, email me, Becky, but email me webinars@weavinginfluence.com. And our follow-up email today will come from that email address. So when you receive it, you can reply and give us feedback. And then randomly, we're going to select two folks for an hour of coaching with Willy. Willy, do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share as we wrap up
No, I
our
think the key
investment with?
thing is, do your best to learn how to be the best manager you can and inspire your leadership at all. It's a wonderful way to, make a living, and I hope you enjoy the book immensely. Thank you very much for your time today. I appreciate it.
Thanks. And one more to enter the giveaway from today's event is webinars. Just like go to webinars where we've been doing what we call